What a voice Renee has. Makes me feel wiser than I really am. Thank you. The scholarship from the University of Iowa that Renee referred to was mostly paid for by the proverbial little old ladies in tennis shoes that Iowa used to be known for. And I think they had no idea when they gave me the scholarship to come to the Writers' Workshop in Iowa at a time when that was the only place in the whole wide world that gave a university degree in creative writing, that I would write the kind of sex and violence stories that I ended up doing. My father was a sort of feudal style patriarch in Bengal and had no idea that writing could be a dangerous weapon against patriarchy. He equaled writing, or he called it scribbling. Isn't it nice that she scribbles and has a gift for the pen? And he sort of equated it with other womanly accomplishments such as embroidery and flower arrangement and international cooking, all of which lessons I was forced to take in order to make me a little more marriageable than I was, largely because at age 3 I fell down and cracked open my forehead, and there was a scar that they said was a physical blemish that would make it very hard to find a husband. So now you know the secret behind my having fallen in love with Clark. It was a blue eyes as a start, and then grabbed him in 2 weeks before he could change his mind. Before I begin my actual reading, I just want to say I'm blown away by the generosity, graciousness, and incredible electricity that this conference and conference organizers have demonstrated. I've never been to a conference like this. And the capping this afternoon, I owe to Kathy Lynch, who, in the sun, there I am without much clothes on, under a towel, and she pummeled my body, macerated all bitterness out. She's a great massage. And so I'm so relaxed tonight. I feel like Perry Como. The young people here probably don't know Perry Como. Clark did such a bang-up job, I'm almost resentful, on the short story this morning that I feel I ought to read a couple of very new short stories as well as a little excerpt from Desirable Daughters from the book tour for which I've just come out. I write short stories in between chapters of novels as a relief and between novels. I've just been, I won't say forced, encouraged by my agent to sign up for, sign a contract for a sequel to Desirable Daughters. So as soon as I go back to San Francisco from the conference and a week's vacation in Quebec, I'll start the sequel. But in between, I'm writing stories for a book that'll be called rice balls and fish balls. So I'll read two shortish stories from that, and then an excerpt from the novel. The first one is called Connubial Bliss. My name wasn't always Harry Hideaway. I grew up Harish Mohan Patel, the second youngest of 7 sons of Mohan Vithalbhai Patel of Mithapur, Gujarat. The legal name change came to me as an inspiration when I bought this motel last winter. Harry's Hideaway, comfiest beds, cheapest rates. When in Granada, etc., I joked to my wife. Not in Granada, Spain, she said. My wife has seen more of the world than I have. Her father is in petrochemicals, and her paternal uncles own businesses in Kenya, Dubai, and Bahrain. She was born in a big city, Baroda, I in a coastal village. I therefore defer to her. But in Granada, Colorado, I objected. You don't like the name? I chanted, hideaway, 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 like a mantra to hypnotize her. Finally, she gave in with a shrug. She said, you be Mr. Hideaway, I'll stay Mrs. Patel. Good thing we're not a Red Roof Inn. It wasn't an enthusiastic endorsement, but from the way her cobra-long braid writhed down her back as she kept shrugging, I decided she not only approved, but was trying to hide her excitement. We've been in the motel business in Colorado long enough to know that taping an American-owned sign to the window doesn't mean what it should to customers when the owner's name is H.M. Patel. What we've learned about motel management, we've learned on the job. My formal training is in mechanical engineering. My wife has a bachelor's degree in domestic science. Until 7 years ago, 7 years and 7 months to the day today, to be exact, I was the chief engineer of Automoto, a company that still manufactures automotive parts in Detroit. Mrs. Patel and I were living with our 3 lovely girls, Mandana, Kirti, and Kanta, in a 5-bedroom detached in Southfield, Michigan, in those days, and not in a motel room with 2 double beds. Getting into motel managing was Mrs. Patel's brainwave. Downsizing is a global phenomenon, she said that night that I had to inform her that I'd been let go by Automoto Limited. My brilliant idea had been to get myself killed in an automobile accident. That way, Mrs. Patel could collect on my life insurance policies. I'm a great believer in insurance. Accident, earthquake, flood, lava damage, hijacking, my family is protected. But what insurance company offers a policy against shame? That tortured night in Southfield, after the girls had gone upstairs to bed, Mrs. Patel brought me a brandy, and with it, a month-old letter from her sister whose cardiologist husband had invested in tenements and motels rather than in stocks as I had. Last month, 3 more, she said. A slum landlord, I muttered. In this country, you know what judges do to slum landlords? 3 motels, she said. Slum tenants in America are nothing but trouble. We should have bought a motel when you still had a... Who's going to hire a 48-year-old man? Is that your point? I took a long, self-pitying swallow of brandy. Mrs. Patel let that pass. Instead, she concentrated on coiling her thick braid into a bun the size of a baseball and anchoring it to her head. This involved much frowning and signing as some of the hairpins, big thick metal ones with sturdy prongs that she stocked up on in her favorite Indian grocery-cum-variety store in Detroit just before we left, went through the bun and gouged her scalp. When she was done, she said with a beatific smile on her face, God is sending a message, but you're not hearing because of all your earwax. Shall I heat up a little mustard oil? She herself was a vigorous user of hygienic devices such as tongue scrapers, oil-dipped Q-tips, and poultices. What's the message, I cried. Starve to death? Go on welfare? Go back to Mitapur? The losses automotos, Mrs. Patel snapped. Now you work for yourself. That's the message, more or less. Be your own boss. Where is the capital, foolish woman? You need capital to get started. That was unfair, I knew. My wife, the daughter and granddaughter of wily businessmen, fills out our income tax forms. 3 new motels just last month, she said. 2 of them in New Jersey itself, Paramus and Patterson. Why hire a stranger when you can get a relative's help? My wife's sister, Mrs. Shaw, lives in Bloomfield, New Jersey. The sisters have 2 uncles, both with large families in Jersey City, and a married brother in Hoboken. I understood that she wanted me to write to Mrs. Shaw's millionaire husband about my willingness to manage one of his motels. Bring me an atlas, I said. And I said this only after I'd finished my second brandy. What for? She objected. You know where Paramus is. You went to Paramus Mall with us. But she shuffled across the den in the worn-down slippers with zebra stripes she couldn't bear to throw out because it had been a Mother's Day gift from the girls, and pulled out the Rand McNally easy-to-read travel atlas from under a stack of board games on the lowest shelf of the bookcase. Where's the third? I asked. What third? The third of Dr. Patel's new properties. Somewhere where we don't know anybody, Colorado. Where in Colorado? What's wrong with New Jersey, she demanded. What's wrong with living closer to relatives who care about us? What town in Colorado? I persisted. You look it up in the letter yourself if you're so keen. I scanned the letter. Montrose. I played my trump card. God is sending me a message too. God is saying, choose between Montrose and Mitapur. That's how we got into the motel business in Colorado 7 years ago. Mrs. Patel and I co-managed the Bellevue in Montrose for the cardiologist brother-in-law for 5 years. The profession did take some getting used to. The pay was 1/5 of what I'd made my last year at Automoto. The work hours were all night as well as all day. But Mrs. Patel, who despises despair, reminded me that I had job security. Also, that the air was fresher in Montrose than it had been in Detroit, though the only times she stepped outdoors was to get in or out of her car. Each time we discovered efficient, experimental methods for removing gum from broadloom, crusted vomit from the inner edges of toilet bowls, and cigarette burns from Formica countertops, she announced, "This is what God had in mind for us. Patent this invention and make a fortune." The only job I refused to let her help with was registering guests between midnight and 4 a.m. Not that Montrose is any less safe a town than Detroit, but doing the night shift by myself was the only insurance policy available to me. But Mrs. Patel is a persuasive woman, and within weeks she coaxed me into relaxing my rule enough to allow her to sleep in the office on a cot behind a canvas screen that little Kirti decorated with crayon pictures of pointy Indian mountains. In Southfield, we'd put up Kirti's drawings, Kanta's essays, and Mandana's report cards on the refrigerator door in our eat-in kitchen. At the Bellevue, we improvised. No self-pity is being invited. The truth is that imagining Mrs. Patel asleep on the cot behind that screen turned me on more than she ever had in person in Southfield. More even than that time just after Kanta was born, when she had failed a love quiz in a ladies' magazine, and so had bought herself a pink sleeping suit with ribbons and frills. Even her snores sounded voluptuous to me. We might have gone on co-managing the Bellevue for Dr. Shah longer than the 5 years we did, if Dr. Shah hadn't got himself snared by some Medicare fraud sting operation. His investment properties, the Bellevue included, had to be sold to pay trial lawyers who were trying to keep him out of jail. Mrs. Patel's sister broke the news to us very late one night from a payphone at Newark Airport. Mrs. Patel took the call on her cordless, which she keeps on the cot all night in case of a holdup, and I listened in. The sister called her doctor husband a word in English I hadn't heard her use before. Nincompoop! Just my luck. Then there were sobs. A nincompoop who didn't know enough to cover his tracks? Mrs. Shaw sobbed some more, while my wife tried out calming platitudes. My wife said, "Luck isn't luck." The sister said that she was going back to Baroda for good and that she was taking the children with her. Luck is how you respond to an event, my wife persisted. Clouds look like clouds to some people. To others, they look like silver ingots, ripe for smart investing. My investment took a bad beating, the sister snapped. Dr. Shaw's troubles led to our buying Harry's Hideaway. While angry Mrs. Shaw was jetting high above clouds, I checked all ads for motels in the investment properties for sale columns of the 2 Indian American weeklies that I subscribed to. That's how I found Harry's Hideaway. It required the lowest down payment of all motels listed, and the seller, a Sri Lankan Tamil who needed cash to smuggle his family out of Jaffna, was as desperate to sell as Mrs. Patel and I were to find a new motel roof over our heads. Harry's Hideaway in Granada. I like the name of the town as well as that of the motel. Granada. Good things would happen to me in Granada. Like sages who retire deep into forests to meditate, I would retreat into my deepest self in Harry's Hideaway. I drove down the asking price over the phone without finding out from the Travel Made Easy Atlas where exactly in the state Granada was located. Good things did happen. They're still happening. I'm falling deeper and deeper in love with Mrs. Patel with an exuberance that shocks me. But what good is passion if it does not make you shudder at the limitlessness of its possibilities? My new happiness was jump-started by one small adversity. The seller had fixed the books to look as though he'd made more money than he really had. We discovered that we'd got more traffic in one day at the Bellevue than we were luring in a week at Harry's Hideaway. We tried different promotional baits. We offered 24-hour samosa and coffee in the lobby, Mrs. Patel's "We wash while you sleep," and even threw in free ironing and mending. Then we got wise to the American-owned signs other motels put up. So Kirti painted us a big, beautiful American-owned sign, and we stuck our sign in our window. Still, 70% of our rooms stayed vacant. Finally, Mrs. Patel hit upon the idea of renting by the hour. Now, the no vacancy under Harry's Hideaway lights up the gloomiest night of rain or snow. Most of my rooms are rented by married couples. Mr. and Mrs. John Smith, Mr. and Mrs. Joe Blow, Mr. and Mrs. What's It to You? Sometimes they bring their children along. I wave to the girls with bruised smiles the age of my Kirti, and boys with sad eyes and flamboyant tattoos. I provide a cheap roof over the heads of all who need it for however long. I watch over my extended family through holes in walls and mirrors. They kiss, they caress, they tangle and tumble through love's fierce pace. I read their lips through my peephole. You bitch, they moan. You cunt. You angel. From my hideout, I undress Mrs. Patel as Joe Smith tears clothes off his Mrs. Joe. I shuck Mrs. Patel's zebra-striped slippers off her tired feet. My tongue licks the harsh, cracked skin of her heels. My body shudders against her body and drinks its fill of sweet fragrances. Sandalwood, Lysol, Listerine, cumin, turmeric. Oh, Harry Hideaway, I whisper into flocked wallpaper. You have been lucky. very, very lucky. The next story is from the same book, and it's about people homesteading, immigrants homesteading, some of them having to, realizing that even when you land where you thought you were going to be at home, you don't, and some not making it at all to their destination. The next story is called Even Macau Girls Get the Blues. It's about a Goan young woman, and while this young woman is still in Goa, I'm going to pronounce the Goan Portuguese words in an Indian Goan way, and if she gets out of there, I'll do a more Portuguese number. Even Macau girls get the blues. I was born in a hidalgo with ochre walls and red tile roof in the leafy Fontenas neighborhood of Panjim when Goa was still a Portuguese colony. Hidalgo was Mama's word for the dank, decrepit, veranda-wrapped house Father, Mama, and I lived in. Though Mama was as cinnamon brown as Father and I were, she claimed unadulterated Portuguese ancestry. She insisted that she was a direct descendant of the Portuguese viceroy who over 100 years ago had founded Panjim. These days, Panjim is known by its Indian name, Panaji. And Mama, she's made herself a fun life with a much younger husband in Belize. My late father, José Valadares, was the only one of the 5 watch and fine jewelry repairing Valadares brothers to stay on when India liberated us from Portugal. All my paternal uncles ran off to Australia or to Canada with their large families. Many of our Fontenhouse neighbors, too, got out as fast as they could find jobs in other countries. Dr. Farias, the periodontist who'd owned showy pink house across the street, fled to Perth. Tristão Salgado, the bachelor actuary, he vanished into the snows of Calgary. My best friend, Selena Pinto, was less lucky. She and all her brothers and sisters-in-law ended up in Maputo. The 3 Mrs. Dyed-haired D'Souza's, school teachers who taught elocution and penmanship to both Mama and me, set up a charm school in Karachi. Father, Mama, and I were the only ones to stay put in Fontenhouse through the monsoon season of 1972. Then, early in September of that year, Father died of cholera, and Mama merry widowed her way to Lisboa. The morning we buried Father, I shared with Mama my fantasy of learning the watch-repairing trade and keeping the Valadares reputation going. But Mama recommended that I take my half of whatever we got from the sale of the Hidalgo and chase love and luck in a country where people still cared for Fado. She took her half and vanished within a month of the funeral. That Christmas, she C-mailed me a photo of herself, looking pretty sleek in a white bathing suit. That photo changed my life. Filomena Valadares had been overcautious or cowardly. I quit my nothing job as a shipping clerk, closed down my savings account, and bought myself a medium-quality forged Portuguese passport under a new name, Maria Pinto. Maria Pinto looked for love and found heartbreak, first in Penang, then in Hong Kong. Then in the over-ripened month of August the following year, she took the ferry from Hong Kong and slipped into Macau. The cheap hospedaria in Macau that I rented a room in was run by a Macanese widow named Mrs. Ribeiro. She looked to me to be about my mother's age, which is 53. Mrs. Ribeiro had a motherly heart, a girlish waist, a love of poetry, and a passion for gambling. Maybe it was the gambler in her that worked to my advantage. She not only didn't question the authenticity of my passport, but she introduced me to her high-rolling friends, many of whom turned out to be government officials and, thank goodness, policemen. My room at the Ospedaleria was a quarter the size of my room in Fontainebleau. When I leaned out its only window, I smelled the sweet and sour tartness of garbage rotting in the alley below. All the same, Mrs. Ribeiro and I made a more convincing mother-daughter team than Mama and I ever had. She cooked me care packages of crab vindaloo, hot prawns, and pork chorpatel. Some slow weekday afternoons, she took me on long strolls through the Camus gardens. On these afternoons, she declaimed epic lines from Luis de Camus, the Portuguese poet after whom the gardens were named. She found me temporary jobs by talking me up as a data processor to her business acquaintances. She taught me betting games with lilting names, Fantan, Daisu, Paikau. After a few weeks, she began dragging me, for luck, she claimed, into rooms reserved in casinos for the highest of high rollers. It was, of course, through Mrs. Ribeiro that I came to be courted by Orfeo Chang of the brokerage firm of Chang, Chang, and Chang Associates. I'd been a roomer at Mrs. Ribeiro's for over a year when she insisted that I tag along to a banquet at a Chinese high roller friend of hers. This man must have had a serious fortune to squander. I've never been in a mansion that huge and over-decorated, nor to a party that boozy and deluxe. The upshot of this excess of hospitality was that both Mrs. Ribeiro and I had too many glasses of Mateus Rosé. We flirted with the same handful of middle-aged playboys, and even let ourselves be groped so hard on a candlelit balcony overlooking the ocean that wine sloshed on our matching silk blouses. Around dawn, we ended up having to accept the favor of a ride home from a paunchy, bespectacled Chinese fellow guest. For the next 2 days, we coped with a worst-ever hangover. By the third day, Mrs. Ribeiro felt recovered enough to hold forth on the good looks and the gallantry of that Chinese man. She recalled a boyish dimple on his left cheek. She went into rhapsodies about the elegant contours of his ears, the thinness of his lips, the subtle blue of his silk shirt, the deep blue of his sapphire cufflinks. Even the pomade on his thick black hair had smelled expensive. He had to be a man of means, she explained, as well as a genuine gentleman. After a couple of days, she moved on from the man's physical appearance to his personality. He was shy, she said. He was shy, but deeply romantic, because she now remembered him having ogled her from far all night. When his chance to introduce himself finally came, he had seized it. That's what must have been behind his chauffeuring us back to the Ospedaleria. She'd heard from someone at the party that the man was our host's financial planner. So wasn't it plausible that he'd planned the evening to end for her as it had? I had no reason to dispute Mrs. Ribeiro's memory that the rescuer had silently lusted after her. For the next few days, Mrs. Ribeiro kept vigil by her private phone. She sent him telepathic messages to call her. He went from being called that kind man to my Chinese knight in shining armor, to my beau. Pale-skinned and youthful to begin with, she grew paler, more girlish. When she became too paralyzed by lovesickness to do anything but pray for the phone to ring, I took over at the reception counter. The work wasn't taxing. A few tourists did come through every day, but after I'd shown them all available singles, doubles, and multiple occupancies, they usually wandered away without renting. There were only 3 of us long-term roomers, the other 2 being ailing and elderly Macanese men who may have been Mrs. Ribeiro's relatives. Sometimes, as I gave scruffy backpackers a tour, I saw the place that I'd made myself at home in through their eyes and panicked. I didn't want to end up a sick, caustic, solitary roomer in a dead dump. Mrs. Ribeiro continued to sit by her phone, one sprightly hand on the receiver, and fantasize out loud about her first date with her stockbroker beau. The beau didn't call Mrs. Ribeiro, but he did send a sealed, business-size envelope by courier. The letter was addressed to Maria Pinto. Inside, on Chang, Chang, and Chang Associates stationery, was a single word-processed line. "You have set loose longings I had chained, Orfeo." Mrs. Ribeiro was dozing in a wing chair, one hand resting on the phone. I could have broken her heart by waking her up and showing her the note. Or I could have treated the note as a hoax and torn it to shreds. My Fountain-House days as a shipping clerk and occasional watch repairer hadn't prepared me for handling anonymous love calls. So why did I tuck the business-size envelope in my pocketbook and roam Macau's business district, tracking Orfeo? The brokerage firm of Chang, Chang, and Chang Associates turned out to be on the third floor of a tall, new office building. I checked out the names of the occupants on the board in the lobby. A few Changs and Lees, only one young, many Singhs, Kumars, Swaminathans, Ranganathans, Mendozas, Da Silvas, Pintos, all operating gem businesses. Valadares wouldn't look at all out of place on that board. I felt part of a tribe of entrepreneurs who gambled on Macau to bring them better luck. On an impulse, I took the lift to the third floor. A middle-aged Chinese man opened the glass-paneled front door to the office. He had a paunch. He wore old-fashioned bifocals. Except that he was dressed in more formal clothes, he looked more or less like the courteous man who had driven Mrs. Ribeiro and me home. The man, however, didn't give away any sign that he'd sent me the brief, passionate note. I could have been a client or a cleaning woman. "Am I in the right place for leaving a message for Mr. Chang?" I mumbled. "Mr. Orfeo Chang?" The man bowed from his waist and gestured me to step inside. I took that as an admission that he was Orfeo Chang, but not necessarily the Orfeo of the roused passions. "I don't know if I'm in the right place," I said. I'm not in need of financial planning. I don't have any money to invest. Full stop." The broker executed another bow. This time, it was a slight dip and rise. The harsh office lights gave his balding head and his stooped, dress-shirted back a fluorescent halo. "Not to worry," he said. "After 5 p.m., I'm no longer a working stiff. I'm a poet." He closed the door behind me. Then he turned the lock. "You can't be too careful these days," he explained. "We've had burglaries, 2 on this floor." I didn't feel threatened. Mrs. Ribeiro may have been wrong about her beau being a man of means. I took in the neat rows of metal desks and battered chairs, the outmoded computers, the clunky printer, and the modest desktop copier. The drawers of the filing cabinets were so stuffed with folders that they stayed partly open. The offices of Mrs. Ribeiro's friends that I'd temped in were definitely more upscale. A tall screen partitioned off a small carpeted seating area, furnished with a pair of boxy, antique chairs and a set of nesting tables topped with an orchid blooming in an ornate ceramic vase. It was in this screened-off area that Orfeo Chang and I thought, would work over cups of teas from a thermos, and separately intuit our next moves. But the broker escorted me to a neat metal desk, and offering me his own cushioned swivel-back chair on rollers, lowered himself into a smaller, sway-legged wooden chair. "I am happy to receive you," he said. He absently touched the tops of 3 pens clipped to the pocket of his starched, crisp shirt. Each pen had the Mont Blanc white star on its cap. "Please to begin." I don't know what I was. He didn't help me out as I'd hoped, but by looking away from me, he didn't embarrass me either. That gave me hope. "I came to thank you," I gushed, "to thank you in person and to apologize." "To apologize? Why?" He rocked his chair back and forth. The chair legs made soft, moaning noises under his weight. I let missed cues sparkle like static in the stuffy air between us. The broker started up again. "I commenced my first poem the night I made your acquaintance," he confessed. "I would like to recite a stanza to you." "Oh, I don't mean from my own dilettante attempt. a verse from the world's greatest poet. Then he launched into his recitation, eyes shut for concentration, paunch heaving with poetic feelings. The verse was in archaic Portuguese. I understood a phrase here and there, enough to guess that the poem was about a dark-skinned, beautiful woman who had stolen the perishable heart of the poet. But mostly, I caught the mood of elegiac hopelessness that the words were meant to convey. "Camus," he said after he'd finished reciting. Then he opened his eyes. In the broker's dark, dilated pupils, I imagined I was detecting a lover's longings. "Camus visited your country. He became enamored of a slave there." I said, "I should get going. Thank you very, very much for all your kindness." "I did some checking up," he said. The research was not on Camus's travels in India. "Philomena Valardes," he said. I'd almost forgotten the name I'd been christened. Orfeo held out a courteous hand for me to shake. "Philomena Valardes, will I have the privilege of seeing you again?" I hadn't guessed that being blackmailed felt so seductive. The next morning, I thumbed through the few books that Mrs. Ribeiro kept in a locked glass cabinet beside her bed. Most of them were paperback mysteries. All the hardcover novels had the South China Seas as setting. The books with creased spines and faded gilt lettering were biographies of European adventurers and politicians I'd never heard of. There was also a fancily bound copy of Camus's Os Lucides. I was ready to give up when, jammed tight between two biographies, I found a skinny anthology of some of Camus's short poems translated into Victorian English by Viscount Strangford. I skimmed the anthology for the poem about the irresistible Goan slave. The Victorian Viscount must not have approved of interracial, interclass romance. The only indirect acknowledgement he made of Camus's love for a non-European woman was his explanation of the lines, "I was caught in folly's snare and joined her giddy train, but found her soon the nurse of care and punishment and pain." The nurse of care and punishment and pain, Strangford speculated in his appendix to the anthology, was a Negro girl with whom Camus committed one of those little transgressions of which our poet was often guilty. I showed up at the Chang, Chang, and Chang offices the next night, this time by prearrangement. Orfeo and I sat in the same chairs we had the evening before, this time side by side and touching hands instead of facing each other. He courted me by reading aloud his own sad, sweet English translation of the poem about the slave, the blackness of whose beauty and the luminosity of whose innocence makes the traveler poet question all that he'd been taught about what's civilized and what's savage. All the time that Orfeo read, I couldn't take my eyes off his face. The skin on his forehead glowed with a passion that I'd never expected abstractions such as blackness and innocence to generate. Orfeo recited, then re-recited his translation. I remembered how in Fontenhaus, Mama slathered bleaching cream on her face every night. She'd tried the cream on me too, but I'd broken out in rashes. She'd wept that I was doomed to a lifetime of cinnamon coloring. How could Mama claim for me, as she did for herself, a blood connection with the European adventurer who'd founded Go as a colony? Brownness, Orfeo improvised on the third recitation, so mud-soft and smooth, that the whitest snow longs to be brown like you. Suddenly, I was not shackled by Mama's anxieties for me. I was Maria Pinto of Macau, a woman who'd invented herself into citizenship. I'd waged the battle against Mama, but Orfeo and his beloved poet had speeded up my victory. He'd come to me not as a colonizer or missionary, but as an accidental mentor. I felt potent and simultaneously at peace with myself. In that mood, I leaned over the arms of my office chair, seized Orfeo's shoulders with both hands, and kissed him on the mouth. I must have hurled myself at him with too much force. He pulled back instinctively. but I was too intoxicated with Commercia's lawless love for the dark slave woman. I passed my sandaled feet hard against the floor for momentum and lurched my chair with its caster wheels into Orpheo's stationary one. His feet kicked forward in self-defense. Was it bewilderment that flushed his cologned and close-shaved face? Harlot, it was whispered by a man who'd stumbled into a revelation. Paper cuts sting. Flesh wounds leave permanent scars. In my grief, I ran to the front door. An embarrassed Orpheo fished the key to the door out of his pants pocket. Ever so sorry, he kept mumbling, ever so sorry. He couldn't let me go until I'd allowed him to explain himself, he insisted. He hadn't unburdened his love of poetry to me as a come-on. He had found his muse in me. That's what he had meant in the note. I had freed the poet in him. He was eternally grateful to me. I had accomplished what no other woman in his life had. If the note had misled me, it was because the wording had been the imprecise ones of a novice poet. For that he begged my forgiveness. I made my bitter way to the Ospedaleria as fast as I could. Mrs. Ribeiro was waiting up for me. She had shaming news from a friend. The Chinese broker who'd come to her in the car under the pretext of seeing us safely home was a married man with many scandals in his past. She invited me to join her for a glass of port. We had a glass, or two, maybe three. I rambled on and on about Mama's snobbish family claims of being descended from a Portuguese nobleman. At dawn, as pink filaments of light marbled the sky over Macau, I asked Mrs. Ribera if the great Lucian poet Camus had found both luck and love in his lifetime. The answer she provided was precise, but not wholly satisfying. Camus had starved to death, probably in an almshouse. But all the same, he had been a very lucky man, much luckier than me or her, because to the very end, when he was penniless, broken-hearted, abandoned by his patrons and avoided by all his friends, he had been able to count on the love of one person, a Javanese slave, a man named Antonio, whom he had brought to Portugal from his Asian travels. Antonio had roamed the streets of Lisboa with a begging bowl and kept his master alive until the good Lord had decided otherwise. The year is 1999, and the place still Macau. I own Mrs. Ribeiro's Ospedaleria now. Mrs. Ribeiro sold me the place for next to nothing 3 years ago. She moved on to Fall River, Massachusetts, saying she didn't want to be around when the Chinese took over the colony. Some nights when I'm down, I mean really down, I think of making my way to Fall River too, and legally changing my name to Maria Pinto. Who knows? Maybe love and good fortune are hiding out for me in Fall River. There's no listing for Orfeo Chang in the phone book. He must have emigrated from Macau. I never, absolutely never, read obituaries. Thank you. I'm not going to read from the novel. I don't know if there's time for any short Q&A. I'll be happy to. Yes?
Would you tell us one more time what book that's from, those selections?
It's a book that I'm putting together, but my agent wants me to write the sequel to Desirable Daughters first. But this is almost finished, and so we may have a little... I may have to make her understand that books of stories count. Isaac Babel, I'll say this in my craft lecture, but Isaac Babel is obviously a big influence on me. And that kind of edgy compression. Yes?
I want you to know how your family's community responded to desirable daughters and whether they mind being broadcast to the world in this book.
I tell myself, or I used to tell myself, and quite honestly, that I'm a totally non-autobiographical writer. But I broke all the rules of writing that I tell my workshop students with Desirable Daughters and scavenged my life, and those of my two sisters absolutely shamelessly. My parents aren't alive, so they don't get to read it. Of the two sisters, one older and one younger, the younger sister, who's the Bombay-based sister character in the book, she's okay with it. And she's very pleased that her apartment, very fancy apartment, is used as a setting. My older sister, who was going to be the villain in the novel, which turned out to be the most interesting and complicated character in spite of my best efforts, doesn't read. So she tried she bought the book, I didn't send her because I thought she'd get mad. She tried the first 2 pages, but it's in italics, and italics is hard. So fortunately, she doesn't know what happens to that character.
You mentioned Isaac Babel. Why did you make that reference to Babel?
Both these stories, in a way, are my homage to Isaac Babel, is it? I've been calling him Babel, I'm afraid. And the story that I was working with in Macau is the one about a translator, young Jewish translator who finally discovers Maupassant and the ghastly end that a great writer like Maupassant had, where he's in a lunatic asylum eating his own feces. And so that kind of artist relationships is what I had in the back of my mind. And that bringing in a whole world of migrations and hope, but trying to do it in 8 to 12 pages. Not minimalism. I'll talk about minimalism on Tuesday morning when I get my craft lecture, but compression, where you're squeezing enormous material into half a sentence.
Did you write Desirable Daughters with a sequel in mind? And do you feel that the preparation for the book is in any way different than having written the original, being that you may have been encouraged to write it?
When I finished the last paragraph of Desirable Daughters, I knew, my God, I have to do the Tree Bride's story, and that's the unwritten. So I should call it prequel in a way. And I have so much material, research material. I'm afraid, having been in universities all my life, I'm a research addict. And so I did incredible amounts of work on the last quarter of the 19th century. And so much of it has resonance for the kind of culture tilt that we in America or India is going through right now. That the 19th century liberals versus Orthodox Indians did. I want to be able to use that material, and I felt that the introductory part of the Tree Bride, who's the shadow looming over the contemporary sisters' diasporic adventures, didn't get enough due. So the novel will move backwards in time for the Tree Bride character from age 5 when she's married off to a tree through 1942 when she's hauled off by British Raj officers to jail, and forward with the current narrator character who has to come to terms with her own marriage and motherhood. But it may turn out to be very different. Who knows? Yeah.
As a follow-up in the matter of pronunciation, regarding to Isaac Babel, may I just say, please,
the city in New Jersey to which you made reference, I think is pronounced Hoboken rather than Hoboken.
Okay, Hoboken.
Hoboken.
Got it, thank you.
Now, you're welcome.
All right.
My question, though, has to do with that first story, please, because you use the first person, of course, as a male character, and I'm wondering if in doing that you're trying to say, A, there's really not much difference between the male and the female psyche, or B, that you've somehow been able to delve into the male psyche so that you, with confidence, could speak in that, using that particular characterization.
It's a second.
Thank you.
I think because I grew up I was born when there was still British Raj, and then did my early education before the school textbooks had been changed. I had to constantly, in history classes or literature classes, decode who the I and they were. We were reading British texts in which the British were stampeding the Indians, and we had to do a lot of negotiations of sympathy plus who is the I, who is the they. And as a result, instead of, I think it's helped me as a writer to enter many different kinds of people. In Middleman, I have stories from Vietnam vets' point of view, or Iraqi Jew gun runner who's hiding out in Costa Rica, which is actually the most autobiographical of the stories in that collection. I was a gun runner in my past. I was an Iraqi Jew male in my past. But no, I think that one should only take on the character that the writer can confidently sink into, be totally inside. Sometimes that happens. If it doesn't happen, I chuck that draft. I think the ways in which male and female characters think, the consciousness details have to be rendered very, very differently. Thank you very much.
And we've been listening to Bharati Mukherjee talk about actually two new pieces that she has written for a book that isn't yet published.